This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 200 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Helping families feel involved in their child's school experience is a challenge, and underrepresented populations may often feel like their voices aren't being heard. While it can help if school staff buy into the idea of family engagement, it's difficult for schools to make it happen without the right systems in place. That's why I invited Ari Gerzon-Kessler to episode 200 to talk about the Families and Educators Together, or FET team framework he's developed. Ari Gerzon-Kessler is a sought-after speaker and professional learning provider. He is the author of On the Same Team, Bringing Educators and Underrepresented Families Together, which won the gold medal from the Independent Publishers Book Awards for Outstanding Education Book of 2024. Ari is a speaker, trainer, and coach working with schools and districts committed to forging stronger school-family partnerships. He also leads the Family Partnerships Department for the Boulder Valley School District in Colorado. Ari has been an educator since 2000, having served as a principal and bilingual teacher. In 2006, Ari was a recipient of the Japan Fulbright Memorial Fund. As a principal, his school received the Governor's Distinguished Improvement Award in 2013. His leadership efforts to strengthen partnerships with underrepresented families and dismantle unjust practices was featured in Education Week in 2015. In this conversation, we discuss how to get and keep families engaged in the Families and Educators Together, or FET team. What's the difference between the PTO and the FET team, and how can these two teams work together? Event-based planning versus engagement-based planning, and using a combination of technology and in-person events to increase equity and help families feel more included in their children's school experience. And we wrap up by talking about how to set up systems that enable educators to have regular positive communication with families. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with Ari, as well as learn about some of the resources he offers and get a copy of his book. Before we get going, I wanted to mention the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. This conversation with Ari ties in nicely to some of the principles that I teach in the School of Clinical Leadership, because effective support for executive functioning isn't possible without good team collaboration. So that's what I help you do in the School of Clinical Leadership. I show you how to develop direct interventions, as well as train your team, get your team working together, and even give you some strategies for engaging parents so they can support kids at home. To learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Ari Gerzon-Kessler. Today, I am joined by Ari Gerzon-Kessler, the author of On the Same Team. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here with you, Karen. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, so I thought we'd start off by having you just share a little bit about yourself. So kind of your backstory leading up to some of the work that you're doing now.
Wonderful. Yeah, I spent 16 years as a bilingual teacher and then school leader for 9 years, and had a real passion around the achievement and opportunity gaps, a focus on supporting students from immigrant families, but in general, just a deep passion for relationship-centered classrooms. And when I was leaving school leadership, there was this opportunity to lead a family partnerships department here in outside of Boulder, Colorado, for a district of 56 schools. And I had, this reflection that some of what I most enjoyed and was most proud of from my years in public schools was connecting to families. And at the same time, the more I began to learn as well about family engagement best practices, many regrets too of what I wish I would have known or
Yeah.
implemented. So I led the work of guiding a family partnerships department that supports these 56 schools. And in the last 5 or 6 years, the heart of my work has been these families and educator together teams, which I discovered were a great vehicle both for implementing family engagement best practices and also helping schools really become more equitable and inclusive by centering the voices of families and especially underrepresented families. So my book is kind of a guide on how to launch and sustain these teams that really bring educators and underrepresented families together on an ongoing basis to foster a host of systemic changes that pretty much every school in our country, I feel like, is needing. So
Hmm.
that book came out last December, and yeah, I feel deep passion for this team model to drive the work forward. So that's a quick bio of my last
Yeah.
24 years in education.
Yeah, yeah, the Cliff Notes version, but I'm sure there's so much more to it, which so I did want to talk about your book, and really what I liked about it was that I think people know that there are certain families that don't feel engaged, and we talk about the problems, which I would be curious some of the things that you would have known. I know you mentioned that just a few minutes ago, but I like how it gives a specific framework and it's so structured and specific again, because sometimes people know what the problem is and we talk all about the problem, but it's okay, what do we do about it? What's a tangible way that we can make something happen? So I'd love to get into some specifics and even just nuts and bolts of how what kind of team this is, what are all the pieces and the processes and the systems, because I think there's the people issues and the systems issues, and you have to have the right systems in place for all this to happen. But yeah, going back to what you said earlier, what kinds of things do you wish you would have known earlier in your career that you've been able to discover through working on this framework?
Yeah, great. No, and I can come back to the teams more later. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say, Karen, like what comes to mind is one, I didn't have much knowledge about best practices. As a teacher and principal, I wasn't aware of relationship-centered home visits, for instance, which I
Hmm.
think are one of the best practices to build better communication and trust. I also often share that as a principal, I didn't have families sitting around the table as voices and valued perspectives, even when we're talking about how do we improve our family-centered events like back to
Hmm.
school night, conferences,
Hmm.
literacy nights. And to me, I would venture that most schools, it's still that way where the parents are not helping to refine or innovate those events, which
Hmm.
to me is really unfortunate.
Yeah.
And so I was guilty of that. And then, as a teacher, I wish I would have known more about the benefit of ongoing positive outreach. That was something I learned about weeks before becoming an assistant principal. And positive calls became one of the things I was most proud of in terms of implementing systemically. Um, and and I also wish I would have known more about this need to move beyond an event focus and really focus more on the relationship, the two-way relationship piece when we talk about like authentic family partnerships.
Hmm.
So yeah, lots of things I wish I would have known back then.
Yeah. What's the difference between, I mean, and maybe just to kind of break it down a little bit when you say event focused versus relationship focused? And I kind of know what you mean, but I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly, because I do think that a lot of times when we're talking about parent engagement, it is about, well, these are the events that we do, and then it's kind of about planning the events, which I'm sure is part of it, but how do you define the difference between event-based versus relationship-based activities?
Yeah, I love the question. I mean, one piece is when we look at events, how can we reinvent them to make them more relationship centered? I
Mm-hmm.
can go as a parent to a back to school night and not meet a single other parent. I
Yeah.
might listen to a teacher for
Mm-hmm.
35 minutes, but I may not actually have a chance to engage with them or other staff one-on-one. So part of the work our schools with teams have been doing is looking at how do we reinvent those events. But what I mean about shifting towards a more relationship-centered approach, and I'll use an example. So I worked with teachers and school leaders in another state outside of Colorado in July. And when I asked them to make a list of their top family engagement practices, as you were alluding to, 94%-ish, I don't know, 90 to 100, I don't know where 94 came from, but 90 to
Yeah.
100% of what they listed was events.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see as fostering the kind of authentic partnerships that lead to better student outcomes and just stronger school communities is the relational pieces, such as families know how to easily reach out and ask a question to a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers are using apps more and not just blasting emails. Teachers and other school staff are visible after school to connect with families. They're doing home visits. They're reaching out with positive news so that we can move beyond the common complaint I hear from many of our parents, especially at the middle and high school level, of I only really see the educators at conferences, and
Yeah.
otherwise I don't really hear from them. So really being more intentional about the relationship building than the checking a box that they attended various events.
Yeah. I am really curious about how you said the emails versus the apps. And this is just something that has been on my mind lately because I've been talking to people about how we're using technology, and I think most people agree that it makes a lot of things possible, but then also there's unexpected risks, I guess. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious how you see when you think about the ways and the modes of communication, when you think about how are the ways that we could interact with parents, like we could have face-to-face conversations, we could do phone calls, we can plan an event where everybody's, it's not a planned meeting, but maybe there's an event where people show up, or you're communicating in a messenger app, or you're communicating via email. So how do you think about those types of things and using technology to expand the options that people have for communicating so that it's more flexible and people can choose what is comfortable for them?
Yeah, this is an area I'm really passionate about because I feel like communication and its intersection with technology opens the door for relationship building. So one thought and recommendation I'm always giving any educator is ask families in August or September, ideally, and even
Mm-hmm.
if it's January, it's never too late. What's your preferred way to communicate? Because if we
Mm-hmm.
ask that question, we always talk about differentiation for students, yet we
Right.
rarely differentiate for families. And so my belief is a strong combination of in-person connection and then
Mm-hmm.
using technology to harness more communication. I'll give some concrete examples. So,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the tech piece, one element is I'm thinking of one of our family and educator together leaders who last year told me,
Mm-hmm.
I asked my 20 families, how many of you read the emails that I send or the principal or the district sends? And 10 out of the 20 families said, we haven't read a single email,
Yeah.
but we love text. And I work particularly
Interesting.
with families that are bilingual, multilingual, many immigrant families, and they're consistently telling us across 28 teams, overall, we prefer text.
Mm-hmm.
So if a pivot from I'm not reading your message and I'm definitely not responding to using an app like Talking Points that translates already for folks and is like texting, that can open the floodgates to a lot more frequent, succinct, and meaningful back and forth communication. So that's become one of my three priorities in our school district in terms of high leverage projects is let's incorporate, and I think about it from my own family level,
Hmm.
to build relationships and deepen them with cousins, uncles, even my own father. We don't email each other daily, but we do text. So,
Yeah.
like, why are we in education not mirroring some of those practices we do in our lives outside of the work?
Yeah. What was that? You said Talking Points. Is that an app that,
Yeah, that's
what
one
does
of the
that
apps
do?
that I found. So that arrives, it's much of it's free. It arrives to families as a text, so they don't have to be logged into an app. They can
Hmm.
reply to the educator. It translates that message to 150 different languages so that language is not a barrier. Has
Hmm.
a bunch of other features, but it basically just fosters ease so that teachers are telling me all the time, I can now be quicker and more efficient and send my whole class or a single family a quick question or one or two pieces of information. So it in many of our schools has opened the floodgates for communication in a really impactful way.
Hmm.
And then, to your question, Karen, about like the in-person piece, I do feel like that's vital. I mean, I think that's why
Yeah.
I train many of our schools on how do you make conferences more reciprocal, meaningful, and culturally responsive because families regularly say, I got overwhelmed and I didn't really feel seen or heard. So it's looking at like how do we increase the amount of in-person interactions between educators and families, and as I was saying earlier, like make them more relationship building versus sit and get, or it's mostly the educator speaking. And what makes the FET team gathering so much more relational is that we're asking families to talk more than we do in that
Hmm.
gathering. So I can share more about that later. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's some of the combo I see of more purposeful in-person relationship building paired with efficient use of some great technology tools that are now available to us.
Yeah. So I want to get to the FET team because I imagine all of these things that you're talking about, the team could probably uncover. I imagine like you could figure out how parent teacher conferences are going for people by having the meeting, right? I mean, I'm assuming we'll get to the purpose and we'll get to some of those things. I mean, that's kind of the how, right? Like this is the process for gathering some of that information as well as just building relationships. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And without a space to hear families and collaborate with them on solutions, we often are stuck not knowing what we don't know, as well
Mm-hmm.
as like our blind spots, our biases, and barriers that we've unintentionally erected for particularly families that have been on the margins.
Yeah.
The FET or Families and Educator Together team gatherings, as you were saying, like they illuminate areas for improvement. And, one concrete example, I was just planning with a set of leaders an hour ago, and they're leading the way in terms of they do a training for all their newcomer families, which is fabulous. Many of our schools don't have that in place. And what we were devising based on parent ideas at the October meeting was a systemic approach to welcoming families. Relationally, a lot of families arrive, they don't get a welcome letter. They might not, at many of our schools across the country, get a welcome call. They may not be offered a tour by a parent
Mm-hmm.
leader or a staff member. So, what was beautiful with this team I just planned with was parents named an area where that school could get even more effective in its approach. And at the next meeting, parent and educator voice is going to shape what should that welcome letter
Mm-hmm.
consist of? What are other elements of effectively welcoming families? So yeah, that's one of the beauties of it is the voices and space to truly collaborate around solutions.
Yeah. And I know people use the word systemic a lot, but it sounds like the way that you're describing it, it's really just this again, the systems are almost the procedures that you have in place for how you welcome parents and so that it's again system wide rather than just some suggestions or strategies and consistent, right?
Exactly. And one of the gaps, Karen, early on, this is now the 8th year of teams existing. And in the first 4 years, what I saw was we set up and learned a lot about how to create highly engaging meetings that build stronger
Mm-hmm.
bridges between underrepresented families and educators. But in terms of what was rippling back as concrete shifts that the staff was making in terms of implementing family engagement best practices, often it wasn't happening enough. And the 7 or 12 educators who came to the meetings were learning a lot from parents' perspectives, but the whole staff wasn't shifting
Mm-hmm.
perspectives. So about 4 years ago, I really began more systematically
Yeah.
pushing schools in November, December, January, identify the areas for change, and then
Mm-hmm.
use January, February, March to begin carving out those solutions and putting it into practice so that ideally by April and May, those systems are evident across most classrooms so that
Mm-hmm.
it's not just the 3 or 4 staff members that happen to love growing
Right.
around family engagement practices.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's the difference between something that is a system a system change versus a people change. Like one person could say, I want to be better about engaging with families in my classroom, but when it's a system change, it's much broader than that. I want to talk about the team. So maybe we can go back to the the FET team. And I know that's an acronym. So can you define that for us? And then I think one of the questions that people might have is, well, we have the PTA or the PTO. How is it different from the PTA/PTO? So I'd love to go there next. So maybe just starting with the definition of the team and an overview of how it works, and then we can get into some of the specific nuts and bolts of the team itself.
That sounds great. Yeah. So FET stands for Families and Educators Together. And the purpose, as I've alluded to, is, meaningful cross-cultural dialogue, building stronger bridges between educators and underrepresented families, building the collective agency and network between families, because there's a lot of value and power there, helping educators learn from families' perspectives how to better partner with them, also giving families a space to learn about our schools, as I believe many inequities surface
Mhm.
because we dump information about our schools into long handbooks or emails.
Mhm.
So a space, especially for immigrant families, to learn how school functions so they can take advantage of opportunities and feel more connected. And then finally, to create transformative change, as I was just mentioning, that it's not just about learning and connection, it's actionable efforts. And then to your question around the difference between PTA and PTO, their focus tends to be on events, community gatherings, and fundraising. The focus of FET, as I just kind of spoke to, is it has a little bit more of a social justice lens, a more how do we make this a more equitable, inclusive school and hear from a broader array of voices, um, and move beyond that event focus to really the more, like you were saying, the more systemic,
Mhm.
collaborative approach. And when I led PTA meetings as a principal, we might have one teacher there, and FET gatherings really have at least 5 educators, if not, 10 or 15. So those are
Mhm.
just some of the
Yeah.
differences between, and there's opportunities. Some of our FET teams are doing some beautiful collaborating with PTA
Mhm.
and PTOs,
Yeah.
around overlapping goals.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. That I assume that there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration because both purposes are really important for supporting the school and they're a good resource. I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers design programming and interventions to support students' executive functioning in school settings. Social skills groups are often seen as the entire intervention. And when they're delivered this way, they're often done in an academic format where an adult is leading the session and kids are answering questions or discussing various social rules and scenarios. This is a very small piece of what needs to happen. When we think of social skills intervention as just a lesson plan or social skills group, kids get really good at answering questions about how they should be acting in hypothetical situations. However, they often don't transfer any of those things over to real life. This is because real social interactions are not academic situations. We're actually not working on the skills preventing kids from using the information and knowledge we're trying to give them. In other words, we're not building the executive functioning skills kids need to be successful in social situations, not to mention other areas of life. Before you can successfully implement social skills intervention, you need to have a solid understanding of what executive functioning is, both the internal skills and the external behaviors, what successful intervention looks like and who needs to be involved, and what service delivery models can effectively address executive functioning. This is exactly what I show you how to do in the School of Clinical Leadership. In the program, you'll learn why kids continue to experience anxiety or behavioral challenges, even though they're going to therapy or have a behavior plan, common mistakes multidisciplinary teams make when teaching executive functioning, and how to correct these mistakes, why kids struggle with problem solving and friendships, even though they're going to pull out therapy and social skills groups, and most importantly, how to help your team work together to figure out solutions to all of these things. If you are in a related service provider role, if you're a speech pathologist, social worker, counselor, psychologist, occupational therapist, or other professional on a school team supporting students, you can emerge into a leadership role on your team and help to guide these interventions. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. I would love to talk about, I guess maybe just the anatomy of the team, or maybe like I think one of the things that you had said were purpose, people, meetings, and team roles. Can you go into some of those things that you outline in your book when you're just explaining the makeup of how the team works?
Absolutely.
Because I think sometimes people think, oh, the PTA, you've got the treasurer and the secretary and the president, and then the teacher representative and the event planner. So it's different. I mean, obviously there's a different structure to it. So yeah, let's go there.
Definitely. Yeah, let's go into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
And I can, whatever I miss, please prompt me to add, but gatherings are once a month for 90 minutes, and I can go into the content of what we've learned, make those really connective, meaningful gatherings. But in terms of more of the logistics, so the idea is at least 5 underrepresented family members. So that tends to be immigrant families, families of color, and kind of like the idea of a healthy Congress. We don't have it in this country, but the idea of the 5 or 10 or 20 family members represent the diverse communities of the school. And the educators are representing the rest of their staff. So, and that school leaders, for a host of reasons I can or don't have to go into, really are beneficial to have in the room. That's the core. And it's led by typically 2 to 5 team leaders. And the ideal is a blend of staff and parent leaders. Another key component is, I found as a principal, we're often so overwhelmed that we hurry the planning of gatherings. And as a result, they're not very engaging often. And so what I've learned in other parts of my professional life is when we design with ample time and thoughtfulness, it makes a huge difference. So we found that we need roughly 58 minutes to an hour to plan the next FET gathering. So that's like a key element. So there is no prescribed curriculum. The October meeting's based on a lot of what we heard at the September gathering. And we feed families, we provide childcare, we feed everyone actually, we break bread. And do you want me to go into the kind of, what does a typical night look like?
Yeah, I would love to hear about what the meetings are. And so, I mean, I assume there's the planning meetings and the leadership aspect, and then there's the actual meeting itself where you have everybody together. So yeah, let's let's talk about the actual FET meeting itself and what it looks like.
That sounds great. Yeah, and I can go in if it's helpful later into like how do we get people in the room? Because that's been a big
Yes.
part of
Oh,
the
that,
learning,
of
especially when
course, we should
they've yeah,
definitely
when
talk
they've
about that.
okay, great.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of the heart of the meetings, I used to be steeped in the field of SEL, and I've
Hmm.
applied a lot of what I learned about creating an engaging classroom to an engaging meeting for educators and families. And in the fifth year of FET, this is now year 8, I really saw our new teams with a more refined structure were thriving. So that was the year where it was clear, okay, this is kind of the secret sauce or ingredients. And there's a lot of intentionality behind it. But essentially, the structure of a night is we break bread over dinner for the first 15 minutes. Then we do a team builder or icebreaker that gets people laughing and connecting. We then move into an introductory circle. People share their names, their kids' names, their role at the school. And there's usually one prompt to humanize us and build that initial relationship. Next month in November, it's what's something you're particularly grateful for this month. This month it was, something you love about the fall. Everyone introduces themselves with first name from principal to anyone. Um, we share some quick updates and news. If you never read an email from the school, here's valuable information. That's really succinct and brief. And then we go into the two main parts, Karen, of the gathering. The first one we call family learning time. And that's
Hmm.
roughly 15 minutes of what have you told us you wish you knew more about the school and how it functions so that you and your kids can really feel more connected to it. And that's everything from like the role of the school counselor and what we do
Hmm.
for SEL. How do we handle discipline or bullying? What are the after school enrichment opportunities? Anything that's helpful for families. And then the heart of the meeting is a solid half an hour of centering family voices and asking them questions that will help us figure out both what we're doing well as a school to engage families, but also lead to concrete ideas around what we can do better.
Hmm.
And then it closes with, some quick reminders of our next meeting, where we're going from here, and then really intentional closure. I find that many gatherings, it's, oh, sorry, we're out of time. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. So we
Hmm.
always do a closing circle, which again builds connection and community by bringing every person's voice back into the room. And that's usually just a word often of how are you feeling as we close
Hmm.
out this gathering. And what let me know, Karen, that FET was such a needed structure in our schools was whether it was an educator or a parent caregiver, the words were always things like uplifted, heard, connected, seen, inspired, hopeful. So that's kind of the arc of a 90-minute gathering that happens monthly across the school year.
Great. Yeah. So I know we talked about the purpose and the meetings, but to move on to the people, and really it's how do you who do you select for the leader of these meetings, and then how do you get people there? So
Mm, yes.
whichever one makes sense to go to first. Maybe just how do we get people there, especially because I'm assuming that people have to know about this in order for it to happen, and I'm sure that you have to be intentional with the planning aspect in order to make sure that people come and continue to come and all of those types of things.
Yes. Yeah. It's like a perennial challenge and something it feels like in some ways this
Yeah.
school year we figured out more than ever. There's no, silver bullet, but there's a lot of things that we've learned. And I would say too that, for listeners who are thinking, okay, how could I apply this to existing structures or maybe launch a team like this? It doesn't have to be a massive turnout. Like what we've learned
Hmm.
is that some of the most intimate and valuable conversations have been when there's just simply 5 parents and 5 educators in the room. But that said, we do want more voices. We want more people to benefit from all that emerges in the gatherings.
Hmm.
And so a month ago, I got crystal clear on what works in terms of recruitment because one of our teams had leadership that struggled last year, and with new leaders coming in, we applied everything we've learned about recruitment. And this high school went from 2 parents showing up last spring to 32 at their
Wow.
first gathering. So what I would say, on a broad level is Many of our schools today still take the approach of primarily emailing families and maybe including an invitation in a broad parent newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
What we found consistently is a more personalized and multi-pronged
Yeah.
approach makes a huge difference. And I'd say like
Mm-hmm.
the five things we add to those two that are standard are carving out the time for personalized calls, um, prioritizing and front loading that in the early
Mm-hmm.
part of the year. And once families have come once or twice, the meeting itself is what pulls them back again.
Yeah.
Um, we use the texts. So talking points is our tool a week before and then the day before, the day of, a reminder. Um, Flyers home, physical copies that families tell us, utilizing students to recruit their families. We launched a team here at a high school in September, and most of the families said, my son or daughter told me I really needed to come tonight. So we harness the student voice. And then other things like a recorded voicemail from the principal or the team leaders
Mm-hmm.
for hundreds of families so that there's that added layer of invitation. So essentially, when we do all those things in the fall, it greatly increases the likelihood of strong turnout.
Mm-hmm.
And we maintain that to some degree too. We don't take it for granted that families are just going to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And then you asked about the leadership.
Yeah.
Um, I've found, and I mentioned in the book, it's wise to begin planting the seeds for a team in the spring because the beginning of the year, as we all know, is so hectic that to
Mm-hmm.
do this well, you've got to be intentional. So typically, it's some blend in terms of identifying leadership of who a principal tells me is passionate on the staff about family engagement. Sometimes it's staff that reaches out and says, we want a FET team here, and they're a natural choice for leadership. Often with parent leaders, they emerge in the first year, if not sooner, as reliable and strong voices and obvious choices to add as parent leaders. And sometimes it's the principal saying to the staff, who's up for this leadership commitment? And those that are really dedicated and invested stepping forward. And as I mentioned earlier, it's typically 2 to 4, 2 to 5 leaders that are designing and co-facilitating the meeting. And I know other districts would benefit from the book is kind of a step-by-step guide. And I love,
Mm-hmm.
coaching districts as well. And how do you launch a team? How do you sustain it? But I wrote the book in part to give people that step-by-step guide for implementation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I imagine you'd have to start with the team at the school and then the parent leaders would come after you've had the first couple meetings. Or do you
Yeah,
recruit the
yeah, I
parents
would.
before?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say typically many schools add parent leaders the second year,
Mm,
but in
okay.
terms of modeling co-leadership, the ideal is the first year from the get-go, there's at least one parent leader. But you're right, like they don't know what FET is until they've experienced it. So the
Yeah.
reality is they often
Interesting.
get excited to lead during year one, and we don't tend to onboard people in the middle of the year. It's usually if they're interested in the fall or the previous
Mm-hmm.
spring. And sometimes we do know. Sometimes the year before we know like this parent is consistently a voice for change and they're confident speaking in front of other parents as well as educators. So yeah, those are some of the different pathways towards parent leadership. And I'll say, a quick example, and I should also share other stories around like what have the teams discovered and
Yeah, I would
changed.
love to hear about that.
But just a real quick like parent leadership learning for me. A week ago, I
Mm-hmm.
was planning with a parent leader and a teacher leader, and the mom said to us, she said, it was funny. She said, parents are now reaching out left and right this year with questions now that they've realized after 2 years that I'm actually not on the staff at the school. And they're asking me a host of questions that are so valuable for them to know more about. But what they tell me is that they're too shy to ask a staff member because they feel like it's a
Interesting.
small question. And yet the questions are what I ultimately want them to be asking educators at that school. But to have a parent leader being a bridge and saving the educators the time of fielding those
Mm-hmm.
questions is just one of many reasons why the parent leadership is so vital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the time factor and asking teachers to do committees and all of that. I mean that's huge and I think that if you have somebody else who's hooked into the community, it makes it I think what the challenging part about meetings is that it's not that people don't like meetings, they don't like unproductive meetings. So if they see the
Right.
benefits from it, people actually enjoy it. So having a way to facilitate and make the meeting as effective as possible, or again, not, and it sounds like it's a whole framework. It's not just about the meetings because there's a whole process and a purpose and everything. So that's really where you get the engagement is that people want to come back. It doesn't feel like checking off the box where you're just,
Yes.
picking
Well,
up your
and
kids' school supplies or, whatever you have to do when you come to the school and do more of the, task-based things.
totally. Well, and you've inspired Karen. I'm going to just share briefly. We don't call them meetings, we call them gatherings.
Oh,
And
yeah.
for
I
that
think
very
that's
purpose,
good.
that educators have told
Hmm.
us we don't like meetings and especially night meetings. And they say, FET's a rare exception where,
Yeah.
leave feeling uplifted. And I have a whole chapter in the book about effective strategies for team leaders that are facilitating any gathering. It wouldn't
Hmm.
necessarily just apply to FET meetings. And I spent 6 months, a couple hundred hours learning from a mentor who's in Utah, like in-depth facilitation training, because one of my passions in my career has been how do we create really purposeful gatherings where nobody feels like it was a waste of time
Hmm.
and they feel the opposite, like it was connective, uplifting, and really momentum building. So I appreciate you mentioning that, like the problems with meetings.
I know. And again, yeah, like people want people are happy to come when it feels useful. And I would say the same with volunteering or anything that is, to use air quotes, extra work or work. It's not that
Mhm.
people don't like work, they just like to do fulfilling work. It's, kind
Yes.
of a natural tendency. So I would love to hear about some things that you've uncovered or things that have become possible because you've put this framework in place. Like one thing that I wanted to go back to that you mentioned before is you talked about parent teacher conferences and you were able to
Mhm.
uncover some things. So I'd love to hear about that and maybe anything else that has come up.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll share three short vignettes because I think that's where the
Yeah.
power is and
Hmm.
and helps listeners know how does this team really shift practice. So let's
Yeah.
start with conferences, as you said. So um, one elementary school in their first year, parents shared when we asked them after conferences, what was your experience like? And we built enough trust in the first 2 months that they said things like, it was hurried. I didn't
Hmm.
feel like I was seen as an expert on my kid. I wasn't really asked many questions. I didn't have much time to ask questions. And so we broke into small groups and one team focused on how do we make conferences better? And there were two main shifts. One was these were all Spanish speaking families, and we extended their time with an interpreter to make it equitable, where their 20 minutes in the fall was really 10 with the interpreter taking up half the
Hmm.
space. We
Yeah.
extended that to 30 minutes. That made a difference in the spring. And then, I had been studying and tracking what's the difference between a great conference and a not so good one. And
Hmm.
so I led a 20-minute training for the staff on how do we make conferences more reciprocal, meaningful, and culturally responsive. And that short learning alone, with the extra time in March, when we came back and said, okay, how was your second round of conferences? Families were glowing and they said, like, I felt connected to the teacher. There was ample time for me to ask questions, for me to share all the things I know about my kid and just cater it more to what would be mutually fruitful. So that's a good example of like that took us all of 20 minutes at that second meeting with a little bit of follow-up with the
What were some
staff.
things that were different that you had shared during that training?
I mean, one key piece is connecting with families ideally in advance and asking individually, like, if we only focus on one thing at conferences, what would be
Hmm.
most helpful?
Hmm.
Um, Educators leading with some questions, really honoring the fact that the family's known their child for 7, 8, 10, 15 years, and the teacher's known them at that point for 7 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving time for families to ask questions. And then some pieces around like avoiding acronyms, not overwhelming with the data, really like putting context around it. So yeah, those are just some examples of making it more palatable and
Mm-hmm.
connective, not talking to the interpreter and looking at them, but
Mm-hmm.
remaining, maintaining eye contact with the family. And then two other examples that come to mind, Karen, of what teams have done.
Mm-hmm.
One school, a parent shared in the spring at a middle school that she was so frustrated to find out her kid was failing that late in the semester.
Yeah.
And we realized, yeah, there needs to be more ongoing communication, and language cannot be an excuse for why we're not communicating, or a fear of, or an overwhelm around making a lot of phone calls. So the principal sitting in that meeting realized, okay, what can we do? The team brainstormed, and every 4 to 6 weeks, they now carve out 15 minutes for each staff member to text 3 to 5 families that their child is with a D or an F. And that sparks some great back and forth communication. One final example, I mean, one of our teams last year realized they needed to do more positive communication to begin building more trust. The principal gave time for postcards, positive postcards, and
Mm-hmm.
the staff sent, I think, 1,490 postcards over the course of the year to most of their students' families. So those are just a couple examples. And just a final one that's coming to mind is um, families mentioned at one school the need for reinventing back to school night, that
Mm-hmm.
many families from certain communities weren't coming. And so it was looking at how do we make this much more purposeful and attractive to families. And the team created a much more effective 2.0 version.
Mm-hmm. I like the some of those examples, and I know that some people who are listening, they might be teachers, clinicians, administrators, and I think some of those even very small systems issues, like you get an extra 20 minutes to write postcards to parents. That's huge because I know that that is one of the biggest barriers to having those relationship building activities. That really, anytime that I talk with therapists, and a lot of times they're focusing on how do I build relationships with my coworkers, let alone trying to find time to build relationships with parents. But that administrative support and even just a small system change, like blocking out time and saying, I support this in the building, that, I want you to take the time to do this, can be really huge. Because I know a lot of times that's just not, it's not necessarily the culture in schools. It's, therapists with hundreds of students on their caseloads, or teachers that their prep time is already jam packed and they feel like they don't have time to do anything else that is above and beyond just, kind of digging themselves out of the hole that they're in. So yeah, that I think that's really important to have that whole the administrative support behind some of those things too.
Yeah. Well, and them being in the room, Karen, as they hear
Yeah.
the needs and the solutions creates easy buy-in. And I'm really grateful that you highlighted that time piece and I imagine in the show notes, people will be able to find the different articles I've written, but one of them last year I wrote was specifically strategies for effective implementation of best practices. And probably the biggest learning I really took in last year was school leaders, as you're saying, need to carve out that time. That
Mm-hmm.
the plates are so full for educators more than ever, that best practices are less likely to be embraced if it's an add-on. And the principals who make that time for the 15 minutes once a month of ending the staff meeting early for those positive calls, or we're canceling this meeting to go do 2 relationship-centered home visits, that's what exposes staff to those best practices and makes a huge difference. So that's a massive recommendation I would give, whether it's a school leader or if
Mm-hmm.
you're on a staff and your principal's open to a new
Yeah.
practice, to convey the importance of it not being an extra thing we're asked to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just worked into your practices that you already have and given time to be able to do it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's huge. I would love maybe just one final question is what are some ways that you've seen the FET, I guess the FET team
Mhm.
and using their gatherings in conjunction with other organizations like the PTA? What are some ways that they've been able to collaborate in your experience?
Yeah. So I'm thinking about a school that received in October, November of last school year 25 to 30 newcomer families. And the FET team and the PTA partnered up around how can we welcome these families. The school ultimately did like a 6 week, six
Hmm.
session training for newcomer families that built a sense of safety, connection. So that's one example. Another elementary school I'm thinking of, they partnered a PTA and a FET team around like how can we have a parent go-to leader in every classroom
Hmm.
and bring PTA and FET together to talk about community building. So that's one additional way. Another thing that I think our schools need more is a space that principals can convene for the various parent groups to learn from each other as well as build connections. And that could be once or twice a year,
Hmm.
but where all the organizations that include parents get their couple minutes to share, these are our major projects. Here's ways your groups could partner with us. That kind of summit once or twice a year, I think is absent. I know it's been absent in almost all of our schools locally and just
Hmm.
makes a huge difference. So those are some, and I would say, a key piece for us in the early years was that often PTAs and other organizations want to diversify. And what
Hmm.
was happening was they would say, oh, could you have a FET parent or two come to our meeting? But that felt a little tokenizing to the parents. So what we have learned was let's build a robust FET team and then ideally have the teams building bridges. And at some schools now we have parents who come to both meetings and are a bridge back. And
Hmm.
so that's been really meaningful as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just figuring out how to use all these resources is it's always a good thing. So, well, I know that you've shared a lot of things today. Is there anything else, like any kind of words of wisdom that you've learned over the years that you maybe wished that you would have known early on in your career, just relating to family engagement before we wrap up?
Yeah, great question. I mean, what comes to mind in this moment is intentionality. I was presenting last week and was saying we're often doing a couple dozen different things and more our energy is more dispersed. I see tremendous value in identifying one or two really impactful practices. And whether that's for me as a principal, for instance, it was carving out 15 minutes on Friday for 5 positive calls. That was almost 200 calls by the time the school year ended. That it doesn't have to be an overwhelming piece to deepen your family engagement efforts. It can just simply come through intentionality and really selecting practices that make a real difference in terms of sparking more communication and relationships.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that plus what I mentioned earlier of ask families how they want to be communicated with,
Right.
and then send them a message that's more personalized, so that families know that you see them individually, not just as one of many families that you're working with.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So where can people go to learn more about you and your work? And obviously we'll link to a whole bunch of things in the show notes, but yeah, where can people learn about you?
Yeah, so I've shared a document that will be in the show notes that shares articles, webinars, other things that have great information to learn more. Can find me easily on LinkedIn. You can email me at arigerzon@gmail.com. And those are some different pathways. And my book on the same teams, available on the Solution Tree website as well as Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And there's a ton of free resources on the Solution Tree website to guide next steps. So yeah, please reach out if I can support any learning, training, book studies, because I am deeply passionate about seeing schools strengthen their partnerships with families.
Well, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks so much, Karen, for having me. Really enjoyed our conversation and all your great questions.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the resources that were mentioned in this episode. And be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams using multiple service delivery models. So I show you how to do direct intervention, and I also show you how to coach and train others so that you can ensure students get support across their day. Remember that it helps me so much if you tell your friends and colleagues about De Facto Leaders, and if you follow me and leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether you listen on Apple or Spotify or another podcast network. And finally, if you're interested in collaborating with me, if you'd like to invite me to be on your podcast, if you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, or if you have a suggestion for a guest for De Facto Leaders, please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.